There are moments when words fail, not because we lack vocabulary, but because we realize far too late that what we say no longer matters. You've likely been there, entangled in a conversation where logic is drowned by emotion, where the louder you speak, the more invisible you become. A debate with someone unwilling to listen. A confrontation where truth turns to ash mid-sentence. In such moments, have you ever felt the growing urge not to raise your voice, but to withdraw it completely? That still, quiet instinct within you, that is the beginning of power. But society doesn't teach you to honor silence. No, it teaches you to speak up, to defend, to prove, to argue your case until your breath is weaponized and your voice exhausted. Silence, we're told, is weakness. It is submission, shame, guilt. But what if we've misunderstood? What if silence is not surrender, but sovereignty? What if the one who does not need to speak is already beyond the reach of conflict? Nietzsche once asked, is man merely a mistake of God's, or is God merely a mistake of man's? He shattered conventions, burned through moral illusions, and in doing so gave us a dangerous gift, the mirror of philosophy, polished by fire and sharpened by solitude. Within that mirror, a terrifying realization takes form, that most people speak not to reveal truth, but to mask it. They argue not to seek clarity, but to defend their fragile egos. And in a world addicted to noise, silence becomes the most violent rebellion. Nietzsche's philosophy is not merely thought, it is force. His idea of the Übermensch, the overman, is not a man of many words, but one who transcends the need to explain. To be silent, in his sense, is to stand alone not as a victim, but as a volcano, a presence that does not need to erupt to remind the world of its fire. So what is the true nature of silence? Is it a void, or is it a fortress? Is it cowardice, or is it the weapon of those who have nothing left to prove? That is the journey we begin today. We will tear apart the illusion that equates silence with weakness. We will uncover how the tongue, when undisciplined, is not a symbol of freedom, but of captivity. We will explore why those who speak the least often wield the most power. And we will walk alongside Nietzsche, not through his complex texts, but through the living pulse of his defiant insight, to rediscover silence as strength. In the chapters ahead, you will see why the most dangerous man in the room is often the one who says nothing. Why silence can expose a liar more viciously than any truth ever could. And why, in a world ruled by reaction, the power to remain unmoved is not absence, it is ascendance. This video is not a tutorial. It is not a lecture. It is a rite of passage. And if you allow it, it will burn away the noise within you and leave only what is essential. A stillness that does not ask for permission, a silence that does not beg to be understood. So ask yourself, why do I feel the need to always explain myself? Who taught me that silence means surrender? And more importantly, what power have I yet to discover in the spaces where I choose not to speak? If you've ever felt the futility of argument, if you've ever walked away from a confrontation feeling emptied rather than empowered, if you've sensed there must be another way to hold your ground without raising your voice, this is your way in. This is your invitation. Nietzsche did not come to comfort the herd. He came to awaken the lion asleep in every silent heart. Welcome to the silent scream, the one that needs no sound to shatter the world. Words are seductive. They promise understanding, control, and victory. Yet beneath their polished surfaces lies a deeper game, one of fear, dominance, and self-deception. Let us begin at the root. Why do we feel the urge to explain ourselves? Why do we raise our voices, correct, defend, argue? It is not truth we serve, but the ego we protect. This is the hidden machinery Nietzsche exposes. The moral scaffolding of the herd, that collective instinct to seek validation through approval, belonging, and noise. In a society built upon slave morality, as Nietzsche names it, strength is inverted into meekness, power is disguised as humility, and silence is treated not as sovereignty, but as surrender. The moment we feel accused or misunderstood, the average person rushes to clarify, not because clarity is noble, but because ambiguity threatens their self-image. To not explain is to risk being misread, and to the ego, misinterpretation is a kind of death. But what if that death is necessary? What if silence, that feared non-response, is not the end of self, but its liberation? In countless arguments, we do not fight for truth. We fight for narrative. We fight for the last word, not because it resolves conflict, but because it feeds our illusion of control. This is the ego's addiction, to be heard, to be right, to exist louder than the other. But as Nietzsche reminds us, the truly powerful do not need to be heard. They exist like mountains, unmoving, unyielding, speaking through presence rather than persuasion. Consider this. When you feel compelled to explain yourself, who is the explanation for? The other person or your own fragile image? When you argue, are you standing for a principle, or is your silence too heavy to bear? We've mistaken verbosity for clarity and reactivity for power. Nietzsche saw through this masquerade. He understood that most human speech is reactive, a reflexive attempt to regain footing in a world that constantly threatens to expose our inner chaos. The reactive mind is always responding, always chasing, always justifying. It is the wounded animal that barks not out of dominance, but out of fear. In contrast, the observing mind, detached, calm, silent, does not chase approval. It watches, it sees through the spectacle of words, and refuses to dance for recognition. In this lies a terrifying strength, to remain still while others unravel, to witness accusation without defense, to embody silence not as absence, but as ascendance. In this state, silence is no longer passive. It becomes pressure, a psychological gravity that exposes the desperation of those who cannot tolerate it. Picture a debate. One person is calm, unmoved, wordless. The other, frantic, layering argument upon argument, drowning in the need to convince. Who holds the power? Who dictates the terms of engagement? The silent one becomes a mirror. And mirrors do not flatter, they reveal. This is why silence is feared. It offers no escape from the self. It does not distract, soothe, or placate. It confronts. And what it confronts is not the other person, but you. Nietzsche's critique of morality was never just about ethics. It was a scalpel aimed at the sickness of the soul, the need to appear righteous rather than be strong. In arguments, we do not seek resolution. We seek moral high ground. We wish not to understand, but to triumph. But in this triumph lies self-deceit, because it is victory on borrowed terms. We become puppets in someone else's drama. We lose our center. Silence, in contrast, is not a lack of response. It is a refusal to play a rigged game. It is a rejection of the battlefield. Not because one fears the fight, but because one sees the futility of bloodshed. This is the mark of the Übermensch. Not a man above all others, but a man above all games. The overman does not seek to win arguments. He seeks to master himself. And in mastering his response, he renders the argument irrelevant. How many words have you wasted on those who could never hear you? How much energy has been spilled trying to prove your worth in spaces that fed only your insecurity? What would happen if, instead of defending your truth, you embodied it? This is the shift Nietzsche invites us into, from expression to embodiment, from reaction to rule, to speak only when your words are heavier than your silence, to let your stillness be the storm. In practical terms, this means knowing the difference between the two minds that live within you. The reactive mind panics. It rushes to fill space, to fix perceptions, to fight phantoms. The observing mind waits. It watches from the mountain, letting the dust of conflict settle before choosing to act or not act at all. Most people live and die in the reactive mind. They never taste the clarity of stillness. They confuse movement with progress, noise with presence. But the few who learn to stay still, to remain silent even in the face of provocation, they begin to shift reality itself. Their silence becomes gravitational. It draws the truth out of others. It disarms manipulators. It terrifies bullies. Why? Because such silence cannot be predicted or controlled. And in a world addicted to predictability and control, unpredictability is power. To stand in silence is to say, without words, I owe you nothing. No explanation, no permission, no performance. It is to reclaim your ground without lifting a finger. It is to understand that the loudest presence in the room is often the one that doesn't need to speak at all. This is not apathy. It is poise. It is not passivity. It is discipline. The difference is everything. One is fear masquerading as stillness. The other is power distilled to its purest form. Nietzsche's genius lies not in abstract theory, but in this simple, brutal truth. The self does not become strong by shouting louder. It becomes strong by no longer needing to shout. So next time you feel the burn to respond, to correct, to win, ask yourself, is this your power speaking or your fear of being misunderstood? And what would happen, truly happen, if you simply didn't respond at all? Silence is not empty. It is not the absence of noise. It is the presence of something deeper, something primal. When a person chooses silence deliberately, something shifts in the psychological field. The temperature of the interaction changes. The air thickens. What was once a conversation now becomes a confrontation with the self. Nietzsche understood this deeply. He knew that silence does not merely withhold. It reflects. It is a mirror that does not distort, does not flatter, and does not blink. It stands still and forces the other to see. And what they see is not you, but themselves, their posturing, their need, their insecurity, their fear. In this way, silence is not passive, it is aggressive. It is an invisible blade that slices through pretense and exposes the raw underbelly of the psyche. When you stop speaking, others begin to hear things they were trying to drown out with your noise. Their own inner voice, their guilt, their contradictions, their lies. This is the first truth of silence. It is not neutral. It is pressure. Consider this image. Silence as a pool of still water. On its surface, everything is calm, but beneath, it reflects everything above with terrifying clarity. Now imagine standing before someone who refuses to play the game of words, who offers you no defense, no explanation, no reaction. Suddenly, your words lose traction. Your control slips. You begin to spiral. Why? Because you're no longer in dialogue. You are in exposure. And exposure, to the unprepared ego, feels like annihilation. The psychology of silence works like a psychological MRI. It scans and reveals. It destabilizes those who rely on noise to maintain their illusion of order. The talker expects engagement, response, validation. When denied these, they begin to experience discomfort, then agitation, then panic. They start to fill the silence with projections, accusations, justifications. They speak more and say less. The more they talk, the more the silent one dominates. Because in truth, silence is not the absence of communication. It is its highest form. The silent one listens not just to words, but to tone, rhythm, contradiction, and emotional undercurrent. This is not passive listening. This is predatory listening. It is the listening of the lion watching the trembling deer. It is the presence that demands no recognition because it already owns the room. From a neurological standpoint, silence activates the amygdala in the insecure speaker. When there is no feedback loop, the brain begins to anticipate danger. Why aren't they responding? Becomes what are they thinking, which becomes what if they've seen through me? This is the unraveling. The manipulation fails. The charm wears off. The power structure inverts. The one who holds silence now holds authority. The one who cannot bear it crumbles. This is why manipulators, abusers, and narcissists cannot tolerate silence. It is their kryptonite, because their power is performative. It depends on your participation, your reaction, your defense. Remove those and they are revealed, not as strong, but as hollow. They will accuse you of being cold, distant, emotionally unavailable. What they mean is, you are no longer under their control. Nietzsche's concept of the will to power is relevant here. For him, life is not about survival, but expansion, about the expression of one's essence without compromise. Silence, when chosen consciously, is a pure expression of this will. It is not avoidance. It is transcendence. It says, I do not need to explain myself to exist. I do not need to speak to prove I am right. I do not need to argue to hold my ground. This is terrifying to those who are still governed by the need to be validated. It is devastating to those who confuse dominance with control. The most dangerous people in any social setting are those who no longer seek permission, and silence is the signature of that power. It is a sign that the individual has stepped out of the emotional economy of the herd. They no longer trade in approval or fear. They are sovereign. But make no mistake, this kind of silence is not easy. It requires inner stillness. It requires emotional strength. It demands a capacity to endure misunderstanding, to let others misinterpret you, to walk away from applause and condemnation alike. This is not silence born of suppression. It is silence born of transformation. It is not that you cannot speak. It is that you no longer need to. The silence of strength is always mistaken by the weak as withdrawal, but in reality, it is the coiling of a spring, the gathering of force, the preparation for a single word, a single act that will carry the weight of 100 empty speeches. Nietzsche understood that most people fear silence because it threatens the mask. In silence, mask slip, the self becomes visible, and many cannot bear to meet that self. That is why they talk constantly, frantically, compulsively, because the sound of their voice is a barrier against a void they refuse to confront. Your silence breaks that barrier. Your refusal to engage invites their collapse. And that collapse is where truth begins. Watch what happens when you stop defending yourself, when you let their accusations float unanswered, when you meet their fury with stillness. At first, they escalate. Then they panic. And finally, they fall silent themselves. Not because they've won, but because they've lost the illusion of control. This is an invisible blade Nietzsche would have admired. The silent stance that does not need to draw blood because its very presence cuts. It is sharp without violence. It wounds without touch. It speaks by refusing to. And in this refusal, a deeper message is delivered. I am not here to play your game. I am not here to be understood. I am here to be. When you realize that silence has the power to fracture illusions, to reverse power structures, to unmask falsehoods, you stop fearing it. You begin to wield it, not as a weapon of revenge, but as a tool of transcendence. You no longer argue to win. You observe to know. You no longer speak to be heard. You remain silent to remain sovereign. In a world where everyone is shouting to be seen, the one who says nothing becomes unforgettable. That is a paradox Nietzsche saw. That is the secret the herd will never teach you. That silence, when chosen by the strong, is not invisibility. It is invincibility. To master silence is not to possess a mere habit. It is to embody a worldview. It is to train the self to move beyond the reactive, the compulsive, the childish need to be heard. It is to transmute silence from absence into weapon, into shield, into crown. Nietzsche's Overman, the Übermensch, is not simply a superior human. He is a redefinition of what it means to be human at all. He transcends a herd not by louder proclamations, but by silent self-mastery. He is not subject to the moral codes of the weak, nor the emotional tides of the many. He creates value. He does not beg to be understood, because understanding is not his currency. He speaks when the silence is full, and he is silent when speech would only diminish the weight of his presence. In this light, silence becomes a signature of the sovereign individual, a signal that you have exited the theater of performance and entered the domain of command. But how does one wield such silence? How does one become fluent in that invisible language spoken only by the strong? The first weapon is restraint. To remain silent when your instincts demand reaction, when your pride is pierced, when your ego screams to retaliate. That is where power begins. It is not repression. It is death and rebirth. In that moment, the false self, the one addicted to applause, to validation, to righteousness, dies. And in its place, a new self rises. Not louder, but stiller. Not weaker, but denser. This is the inner crucifixion Nietzsche implies, the self-overcoming, where one dismembers a lesser self to give rise to the higher. Silence becomes a battlefield on which this transformation is forged. The second weapon is observation. Silence sharpens the senses. When you no longer need to fill space, you begin to perceive space. You see patterns in others, their tells, their wounds, their vanities. Like a hunter studying his prey, you do not move until movement matters. You watch the rhythm of speech, the micro-expressions, the contradictions. And when you finally do speak, your words are not guesses. They are arrows. Precision forged by silence. The third weapon is temporal mastery. Owning the pause. Most people are enslaved by timing. They respond immediately, compulsively, surrendering their rhythm to external forces. But the master of silence bends time to his will. He lets the pause swell. He lets others stumble over the void he creates. In negotiation, in confrontation, in leadership, the one who controls the silence controls the flow. Power is not in speech. It is in timing. And silence is the hammer that shapes that timing. The fourth weapon is unpredictability. Silence makes you unreadable. You become the variable others cannot account for. While they speak, reveal, confess, justify, you remain veiled. This mystery disturbs them. They do not know where you stand. They cannot map your mind. And what cannot be mapped becomes feared. In a world obsessed with clarity, silence becomes fog. It blinds the enemy, confuses the manipulator, humbles the arrogant. And yet, behind this fog, you see everything. They mistake your stillness for uncertainty. But in truth, it is their uncertainty you now command. Finally, there is active silence, the silence that chooses, prepares, sharpens. This is not withdrawal. It is coiled force. You are not escaping conflict. You are elevating above it. You are not avoiding truth. You are distilling it into a single word, a single gesture that cannot be misunderstood. Nietzsche once wrote that the greatest events are not the loudest, but the stillest hours. In these hours, the future shifts. Empires tremble not at the explosion, but at the quiet before, the silent moment before the leader speaks, the stillness before the artist unveils, the pause before the overman acts. This is the silence that changes the world, not by volume, but by weight. When you enter a room and say nothing, yet everyone adjusts themselves, you have mastered this art. When you are attacked, yet feel no compulsion to defend, you have stepped into sovereignty. When your silence makes others speak more, reveal more, fear more, you are no longer the herd. You become the one Nietzsche foresaw, a creature of terrifying grace, who moves without noise, but shapes reality with presence. And yet, this path is not for the faint. It is not a posture. It cannot be faked. It must be forged in solitude and reflection, in the inner furnace where comfort is sacrificed for clarity. The path of the silent overman demands that you kill your need to be liked, that you renounce the false security of agreement, that you walk away not only from conflict, but from the desire to win, because the overman is not in competition. He has no opponents, only observers. His silence is not exclusion. It is elevation, and those who cannot rise to meet it will call him arrogant, cold, unreachable. But in truth, they are simply unready. This is a final lesson. Your silence is not for them. It is for you. It is your return to center, to stillness, to truth untainted by noise. When the world clamors for reaction, your silence becomes a sanctuary. When the crowd demands allegiance, your stillness becomes a throne. And when chaos erupts, your unshaken presence becomes prophecy. This is not the silence of retreat. It is the silence of command. Not a silence that hides, but one that reveals. Not one that pleads, but one that ends a conversation before it begins. Nietzsche did not whisper to the timid. He roared to the silent lions waiting within them. And if you feel that lion stirring, if you feel that old need to prove yourself finally begin to die, then welcome. You have begun, and your silence will speak volumes. Not all silence is power. Some silence is a mask, thin, trembling, a mimicry of poise born from fear, not strength. This is the silence taught by the world to the obedient, the silence of children scolded into politeness, the silence of employees swallowing truth to keep their place, the silence of those who have mistaken submission for wisdom. This is the counterfeit calm, the performance of restraint, not its reality. And Nietzsche, with his hammer of philosophy, strikes precisely here. He exposes what society calls maturity as often nothing more than domestication, a trained stillness, a behavioral leash. We are told that silence is noble when it avoids conflict, when it defers, when it bows to hierarchy. But what if this virtue is venom? What if this so-called maturity is merely the fear of our own voice, dressed in the robes of respectability? This is the first chain we must break. The illusion that being silent is inherently wise. It is not. There is a silence of the coward, and there is a silence of the master. One hides. The other reveals. The coward's silence waits for permission. The master's silence needs none. Look around you. How many suffer in silence? How many endure abuse, manipulation, erasure, because they have been told that to speak is to be immature, emotional, dramatic? This is how herd morality conditions the individual. To see rebellion as foolishness, to see deference as grace. But Nietzsche called this what it truly is, slave morality, a code of values invented by the weak to protect themselves from the strong, a reversal of nature, where restraint is no longer a weapon, but a chain, where humility is no longer a virtue of the powerful, but a cage for the gifted. To live within the system is to shrink. It is to wear silence not as a crown, but as a muzzle. And every time you silence yourself out of fear of rejection, fear of disapproval, fear of being seen too clearly, you reinforce this cage. But you do not belong in that cage. The overman shatters it, not by screaming, but by refusing to kneel. His silence is not soft. It is cutting. It does not smooth conflict. It defines it. It does not avoid edge. It becomes edge. The transition from submissive silence to sovereign silence is not external. It is internal. It is the moment you no longer care to be seen as agreeable. The moment you stop shaping yourself to fit the fragile expectations of others. It is when you allow discomfort to rise in a room and choose not to rescue anyone from it. Because it is not your duty to protect them from your truth. It is not your responsibility to make your presence palatable. Your silence, once passive, now becomes a choice, a design, a stance. And in this stance, there is no longer space for apology. You begin to walk differently. You begin to look people in the eye, not with aggression, but with stillness. And that stillness unnerves. It says, I do not need you to approve. I do not need to win this moment. I already own myself. This is a silent cry of power. It does not beg to be heard. It simply exists. And in its existence, it changes the terms of engagement. Others may call it arrogance. Let them. Others may call it cold. Let them freeze. The truth is, they are no longer accustomed to seeing someone who does not need the herd to stand. And that is the point. You are no longer of them. You have not abandoned empathy. You have not turned to cruelty. But you have reclaimed your axis. And from this axis, your silence no longer bends. It shapes. It confronts. It defines. This is the silence of presence. Not hiding. Not pleasing. But radiating. In the past, your silence was a prison. Now it is your perimeter. It is an invisible wall that tells the world, here I end. Here your power ends. Here I begin. And in this space, I do not justify. I do not plead. I do not shrink. I only exist. And that is enough. There is a silence that trembles. And there is a silence that commands. The silence we now speak of, what you have walked through, endured, and embodied, is no longer a gap between words. It is the final word. It is a distilled presence of a soul no longer asking, no longer reaching, no longer needing. It is the signature of someone who has already arrived. In this silence, there is no emptiness. There is only essence. And essence needs no explanation. You are not here to win arguments. You are not here to be liked. You are not here to be understood. You are here to live from your center. Nietzsche knew that the overman does not shout across the crowd. He stands so wholly in his own form that the world reshapes around his silence. This is a stillness of mastery, the gravity of self-possession, the roar no one hears, but everyone feels. So ask yourself now, what is the shape of your silence? Is it still hiding? Is it still waiting? Or has it become your presence, your weapon, your sanctuary? If the world demands noise, give it none. If they seek to provoke, let them wrestle with their own shadows. You do not owe anyone your energy. You owe yourself your edge. The silent ones, truly silent, not broken but chosen, reshape the future. They speak not often, but when they do, the ground listens. They are not without voice. They are simply beyond the need to use it recklessly. That is the paradox. That is the final liberation. And now, here is your challenge. Go back into your world and stay still. Do not react immediately. Watch. Listen. Hold your silence like a blade. Let it teach you who you are when no one else is watching. Let it teach others who you are without you needing to explain. And when the moment is right, speak once, but speak as if your voice were the last word that will ever be spoken. Until then, let the silence do the work. If this message found something in you, if it echoed in the quiet corners of your being, do not let it fade. Share it. Send it to someone who's forgotten their power. Comment below, what does silence mean to you now? What have you left unsaid that finally deserves your stillness instead of your defense? And if you are ready to reclaim your voice by first mastering your silence, subscribe, and stand with those who no longer shout to be heard. This is not a community of noise. It is a gathering of presence. One day, your silence will be the loudest truth in the room. Until then, wear like armor. The overman does not ask. He becomes. And so shall you.